This is the Ministry of Truth. I'm Gordon Comstock. Time for Part 6 of The Babylonian Woe by David Astle. Babylon, Banking, and Bullion. Without a doubt, the ramifications of Babylonian banking, as operated from Nineveh during the 8th and 7th centuries BC, extended in more or less degree over that total area from Tartessus to India, and from the gold washings of that great bend in the Nile in Nubia, known as the Bishory, to the mines of Cornwall. And of all such area, it was the focus of land and sea routes. In absolute degree, in the first millennium, it extended as far afield as there is evidence of Aramaic as language of official and merchant classes. That is to say, from Peshawar to Greece. In Greece, the evidence, however, is not so much from Aramaic as language, as from the fact that the Greek alphabet derives from Aramaic, and therefore may be assumed to be the design of refugee Aramaeans of the period after 933 BC, when Assyrian policy, after 40 years of unremitting pressure from the Aramaeans, became the extirpation of the Aramaean, achievable from much strengthened military resources. Acolytes of the bankers of Babylonia, whether from Nineveh, Carchemish, or the Babylonian cities themselves, who sought their own fields abroad, or prominent but unsuspecting natives of the area chosen for penetration, were selected as quote-unquote suitable to open the trade in a given area. Quote-unquote suitability, as in today, being advanced training in money worship, basic lack of integrity, and preferably some black mark in their secret past, making them amenable to pressure, sounds like all of Congress, and anybody in the White House, and willing to grind down their own kind, sounds like all of our politicians, or sell them to the slave trader, sounds like our politicians, without the gate, and without mercy, and without compunction. Can you say American politician? Those refugees skilled in money, from the cities of Aram in particular, though perhaps not qualifying in every specific trait detailed above, being dispossessed, and with therefore bitterness in their hearts, would have served best. They would have considered that alignment with the Babylonian banking houses would be alignment with enemy and destroyer of that which had destroyed them. Such silver money as they later minted and circulated from Aegina and Argos appears, as is explained below, to have been of the same weight and fineness as the Babylonian shekel, being that it was 85 grains to the drachma. Thus, it is evident that the financial organization these Aramaeans created in Greece previous to Solon was outright extension of the Babylonian. In a way, it might have been the instrument of Babylonian imperialism, just as was the entry on the tablet of the traveling agent of the Temple of recording loans made to enable purchase, instrument, 2,000 years before, of that imperialism of Thus the coinage as used at Athens at this time, wherever minted, could be exported and circulated in Babylonia or other cities of this common money market. And while it could be profitably used in settlement of unfavorable Indian trade balances, it could also be returned to Athens without loss or remitting. In the so-called Solonian monetary reforms, according to Grosseklos, the mina, consisting of 73 drachmas, was made legal tender to the value of 100 drachmas, though according to some scholars there is no evidence of Athenian mintage at this time. Assuming Grosseklos and his authorities to be correct, it follows that the real meaning of these currency reforms was the establishment of Athenian home mintage, inaugurating a new coinage of a less weight, made legal tender for debts incurred in the arms of the previous heavy weight coinage minted at Aegina or Argos. However, of this matter, Seltzman, in his Greek Coins, writes, quote, "That was the change brought about by the Solonian currency reform, the purpose of which was not to relieve debtors by lowering the value of the standard coin, but rather to free Athenian trade from a weight system such as bound the merchants to a local Peloponnesian standard which did not extend beyond the Aegean Sea." Unquote. Instead, the Athenians now had a currency based on the old and famous Bronze Age, quote, Euboic talent and mina, and his standard coin was of the same weight of those of the Corinthians, Samians, and later of Cyrenians. But he retained the Fedonian system of dividing his stater into 2 drachmas and his drachma into 6 obols. At Athens, too, the rival systems of currency met and merged, for she began to coin on the Dorian system, whence she derived her obols, drachmas, didrachmas, but under Solon's reforms she went over to the Ionian system and adjusted her money to the Ionic Euboic talent. Unquote. The very fact of the stress on weight shows that such reforms were designed for, and perhaps only really understood by, a group that was only concerned with silver by weight. In other words, large-scale movements of bullion, and who would be none other than our old friends, the international bankers or bullion brokers, possibly even in some opposition to a situation in the Peloponnese or Aegina, such as may have been occasioned by the institution of the laws of Lycurgus at Sparta, when consequently they and their agents had virtually been ejected from those areas controlled by Sparta or influenced by her policies. Solon was more likely the front man they put up to put into effect a program they had designed as a result of the conclusion reached amongst themselves that the notion of Greece as source of the slaves they so desperately needed in a world which consumed so much labor would have to be forgotten if their agents were to be able to continue operating in Greece, and if they themselves were to be able to maintain that confidence and respect of the Greek people so essential to their particular affair. From henceforward, it is clear, the issue was to be loans to industrial workers on the security of their wages. No longer would the banks or money lenders lend to the peasantry, being that now they were forbidden to bind their persons as collateral security and sell them into slavery across the seas in the event of non-payment, or to alienate their lands. To get such loans, which the poor and trusting of the countryside were always craving for one special occasion or another, it was necessary to go to Athens and work for a wage in some industry. It may safely be said that the main industry was mining in Laurion and possibly in Thrace, where quote-unquote free men, for a trifling wage, could join the gangs of slaves clawing their way into the hard rock until further sources of cheap slave supply were found. Although some modern numismatic scholars disagree with the findings of the scholars of even 30 years ago, and with some reason, and certainly may be more accurate in their dates, in the case of Alexander Del Mar, who had both practical experience of mining and practical experience in the field of government finance, and who had made considerable study of the workings of money and finance in antiquity, his opinion is not to be so lightly brushed aside. In his History of Monetary Systems in Various States, on this subject he writes, quote, according to Beck, 100 of the new drachmas of Solon, who was archon of Athens, B.C. 594, were equivalent to 72 or 73 more ancient drachmas. If this were quite reliable, then to Solon belongs the merit or demerit of altering the ratio from 13 to 1 to 10 to 1, because as we have some of the drachmas of Solon and know their contents, the proportion given would make the more ancient drachmas contain about 85 grains fine silver, the weight of the shekel, as 20 of these were commonly exchanged for a gold coin, which, whether a dharana of India, a medimni of Media, a derrick of Persia, or a stater of the Levant, contained about 130 grains of fine metal. The Athenian ratio, previous to lowering the drachma, must have obeyed the ratio of Assyria, Media, and Persia, which was 13 to 1. But according to Quiepo, who is a more reliable authority on the weights of coins than Beck, although we have drachmas older than Solon, they do not contain more than 65 grains of fine silver, so that the change of ratio from 13 to 1, assumed to have occurred at Athens, must have taken place before Solon was archon. However, it is certain from the coins that the ratio under the administration of Solon was 10 to 1, and that it continued for nearly 3 centuries. For it is impliedly mentioned by Menander about B.C. 322 as being still in vogue at a recent period. During this interval, the ratio in the Orient was 6 1/4 or 6 1/2, and in Persia 13 to 1, or double the Indian ratio, unquote. In other words, if these weights of drachma and of shekel, as at that time, are correct, just as the Roman denarius was later issued to practically the same weight as the post-Solonian drachma, which was in use in Sicily and Magna Graecia, so was the early Greek drachma, whether aeginetic or of Argos, i.e. Phaedonian, minted to the same standard as the shekel, the unit of exchange, in Babylonia, Assyria, and Phoenicia, clearly creating extension of the common money market of that area and its financial dependencies. Thus the Greek coin could be exported, circulated at par with the shekel, and even returned to Greece without loss through remitting or smelting to bullion. And also, more important still, could realize that sure profit that the international bullion traders had guaranteed themselves in the Indian trade by prevailing on rulers to maintain the ratio of silver as to gold at 13 to 1, as opposed to 6.5 to 1 in India. In other words, the real significance of the monetary reforms of Solon was the separation of Athens from the financial hegemony of Babylonia and its nearer agencies in Lydia, Aegina, Argos, etc., which, as previously pointed out, may very well have been rendered ineffective by the laws of Lycurgus, considered now a point of great significance, to have been enacted in the early 6th century. From now on, it was going to be forbidden to Athenian merchants to settle unfavorable trade balances with slaves, and almost profitless to settle such balances with silver, either as coin or bullion. Henceforth, the bankers would have to serve Athenian interests and would have to derive their profits from local business, i.e., there would be much more money circulating in Athens, and therefore a healthier industry, which history records as being exactly what transpired. Okay, we're going to take a break. See you in a couple of minutes. Okay, we're back. Time for the rest of Part 6 of The Babylonian Woe by David Astle from 1975. If I sound different, I had to move my operation to the garage. One-horse operation or what? I am literally a garage operation or a back office operation when I can. All right, getting back to the book. According to Grote, the banking system assumed after Solon a more beneficial character. The old noxious contracts, quote, mere snare for the liberty of a poor freeman and his children, unquote, disappeared, and loans of money, quote, took their place, founded on property and prospective earnings of the debtor, which were in the main useful to both parties, and therefore maintained their place in the moral sentiment of the people, unquote. Thus, to such an extent did Athens abjure the international bankers, who must be loosely described as centering in Babylonia, that, insignificant as she relatively was, through the Sysaithia, i.e. the shaking off of burdens, she in reality severed from Babylonian imperialism and its financial hegemony worldwide, and established herself as minor competitive force, as was shown by the Persian efforts at encirclement, towards which their seizure of control of the Thracian mines in the year 512 BC constituted the first clear step. Even if the reforms of Solon were not so absolute as those of Lycurgus in Sparta, and still left silver as the material of the basic monetary unit, and therefore still left Athens at the mercy of those forces whose secret activities contributed towards the functioning of what is known as Gresham's law, i.e., bad money drives out the good. The Persian move of 512 BC by no means took the strength out of Athens and her allies. While securing ship timbers for the fleets they were planning, and also further silver supplies, Persia, wherein nested international money power at that time, thought that she would be cutting off from Athens these commodities so essential to the promotion of war industry. Somehow Athens still continued to maintain itself free of this Babylonian imperialism, which now sheltered behind Persia, and despite the enormous resources of Persia, was able to defeat the quote-unquote great king, both on land at Marathon, 490 BC, Plataea and Mycale, 479 BC, and at sea at Salamis in the famous naval battle of 480 BC. It may safely be assumed that the huge issues of the owl drachmas during the decade that followed the discovery of the third level, or contact, at Laurian, and its fantastically rich ore, substantially contributed to this success. Those designing international money power were just that, international. If the other fellow, too, looked to be on to a good thing, and could offer what its controllers needed most of all, which was precious metals, then a way could always be found to do business. Out of war could only come good to them and theirs. Bingo. Whether the great king remained great in Persia, or Athens took his place, was not of that much importance. They would see to it that none who might be a real threat to them would achieve a similar power to theirs, that is, from an international standpoint. So, to sum up the situation so far as pre-Solonian Athens was concerned, a simple, unlettered people offered all the luxuries of another world as against the new money, whose function is so little understood by lettered people, even in this day, without going back 2,500 years, had become swamped in debt. The law, in respect to this debt, had been upheld by a corrupted nobility in favor of the bankers. No doubt, it had been represented to them by these same bankers that this pressure of debt on the growing population would keep the masses docile and tie to the land, as was indicated by the prevalence of the mortgage tables on the farms of Attica. This condition, favoring the corrupted nobility of Greece and the international money power, ignored the needs of the new rich manufacturers of Athens, who were neither able to obtain sufficient supply of local free labor nor to obtain slaves. Where credit institutions had long since existed, as in the Grecian ports, in a land of relatively simple folk, where the ways of money were no more understood than they are today, by loans of ledger credit page entry money against collateral, demanding in repayment silver coinage, money power obviously had made a very good thing of it in Greece. By the bankers of a given area using the same standard of weight in its precious metal coinage, calling loans in unison, the money supply could be shrunk to almost nothing, on which their agents abroad could send ships and buy crops and men and women and children for a song. The laws of the Archon Solon, by making no provision for employment for the freed debt slaves, nor providing for redistribution of the land, gave the Athenian manufacturer that labor which he most of all needed. The Solonian ordinance, offering Athenian citizenship to any free man from the countryside who came to Athens and took up a trade, further improved the labor market. The monetary reforms of Solon, reducing the export of coin or bullion, gave the Athenian manufacturers the money they also needed, for they remained the only market for the quote-unquote funds of the bankers, native or Peloponnesian, the latter having had no option but to find new lands to conquer, as it were, after their virtual ejection by the laws enacted under the patronage of Lycurgus of Sparta. Finally, it may be said that the laws of the Archon Solon were the manifestation of the growth of the Athenian principle and the rejection, compulsory or otherwise, by all classes of the Babylonian money power, including that growing class who, for the time being, seeing which way the wind lay, might now be called national money power. Phrygia, finance, and front man. The Assyrian conquests must have released a very flood of bullion onto the markets of the Middle East. Steeply rising prices that would have followed must have made it more profitable for bankers and moneylenders and manufacturers from this most ancient area to look further afield for lands where money, as denoted by treasure, was not so plentiful, and therefore wherein such treasure might serve them best. The gold, silver, and electrum bullion with which, after 671 B.C., and the Assyrian thrust into Egypt during the second phase of Assyrian conquest, their storehouses and strong rooms were overflowing, could be put better use than lying inactive in these same houses or strong rooms at Nineveh, Babylon, Lachish, or or wherever they were situated. The privately issued electrum staters of Lydia of the 7th and 6th century B.C. denoted a highly significant possibility. Lydia was the source of something Assyria badly needed. The first thing such military organization, such as existed in Assyria, would need would be financial organization, and secondly, stemming from its financial organization above all towards the purpose of the purchase of the best of arms. Phrygia was famous throughout the ancient world for its arms. Lydia bordered on, and indeed may very well have been part of, Phrygia in earlier times, hence the secret of the electrum staters. Assyria needed Phrygian arms and at the same time had to accept such financial terms as the suppliers of such arms decreed, and it may safely be assured that such terms stipulated payment was to be made in gold, silver, or electrum. The extraordinary treasure of such as Sadyates, later dispossessed and executed by Croesus, cannot be explained any other way. It had to derive from the plunder gathered up by Assyria from all its conquests, as much as from the river washings of Lydia. The evidence of the gold artifacts of the ancient civilizations of Anatolia of thousands of years previous to this time, such as Hasselar, Katulhuyuk, Dorak, would indicate that the Anatolian rivers had been well washed for gold many ages before, although according to the Guide to the Principal Coins of the Greeks, published by the British Museum, pages 12 and 13, electrum for the Lydian coinages came from the Pactolus River. The question still stands: what happened to the enormous gold, silver, and electrum plunder of Assyria that had been taken from Aram, Israel, Arabia, and above all from Egypt? The great temple cities such as Karnak must have literally gleamed with gold and silver monuments and finishing. According to Diodorus, in 57 B.C., quote, "so that there was no city under the sun so adorned with so many and stately monuments of gold, silver, and ivory, and multitudes of colossi and obelisks, each cut of an entire stone. The decorations of these buildings were as magnificent as their design. The walls and pylons were covered with paintings and sculpture. The gates and pillars were overlaid with gold, and the floors with silver, which, to the Egyptians, was a metal hardly less precious than gold itself." Unquote. The electrum obelisks of Hatshepsut, as removed by Ashurbanipal from before the temple of Ammon at Karnak in 661 B.C., contained, according to Breasted, 2,500 talents of electrum. and according to other writers, as much as 2,900 talent. Not to speak of other more massive plunder stripped from temple and tomb. The electrum from the obelisks alone, assuming the correctness of the percentages of gold, silver, and copper given on the cylinder reported by de Roche Noblecourt to be in the Louvre, as being 75%, 22%, and 3% respectively, would value $186,648,000, having a buying power infinitely greater than in today. Skillfully used as the basis of a pyramid of ledger credit page entry money, it would be sufficient to maintain the finances of great enterprise, if not of kingdoms. Lydia, peasant kingdom that had emerged from the ruins of Phrygia after the Cimmerian invasion, could very well have functioned in its institution in a similar manner to Switzerland during the last few hundred years, somewhat in the nature of a bullion broker's or international banker's refuge, which might account, perhaps, for the ferocity of the destruction by Cyrus of the hapless Croesus, who was said to have been flayed alive, as example, no doubt, to other kings, and to remind them that while their power was national, there was another power which was international, above and beyond the power of petty kings, same as today. Similarly, the other metals, copper, bronze, and iron, no longer deemed precious, and which therefore were often left on the battlefield, would fall into the hands of members of those semi-criminal castes, such as Sadyates, previously mentioned, who would control the camp followers that stripped the dead and thus garnered this scrap metal. These metals offered considerable profit by way of manufacturing counterfeits of the currencies of those states wherein base metal currencies were used. Many northern states and cities to which considerable industry was being transferred used copper or iron fiduciary currencies in earlier times. Such was the iron currency of Clazomenae, mentioned by Aristotle, and the iron spits of pre-Phaeton Argos, examples of which were dedicated to the goddess in the temple of Hera at Argos at the commencement of silver coinage by Phaedon, and were actually exhumed from the place of their dedication by the archaeologists who explored that site. Herein would have been fertile field for profit for those that dealt in money in Greece or elsewhere for that matter. Although the Greek himself obviously must have been the foundation of Greek industry, the Aramaean or the Phoenician, bringing the ways of money and banking, and who brought an alphabet and writing to Greece, became the cornerstone of that industry. He also brought agencies from the great banking houses of Babylonia, such as that firm mentioned by Professor Sayce in Babylonian Literature, which flourished from the reign of Nabal-Palasser, the father of Nebuchadnezzar, to the reign of Darius Hystaspes, approximately 100 years, and of which evidence remains in the clay checks and deeds found by some Arabs in a great earthen jar. Since the time of Professor Sayce, which is nearly 100 years ago, much more evidence of the existence of powerful banking and merchant institutions has come to light. Outstandingly, those of the Egibi sons and the Murasu, who, according to Professor Humphrey Mitchell in his work the economics of ancient Greece, carried on very large and complicated business, even by modern standards. Just as Babylonian business and banking houses maintained extensive branches in the Sumerian cities, such as at Lachish, where their records were found to exceed the records of the king, so it may safely be assumed that they maintained branches within any state, within the limits of the communications of the day, and where profit was to be made. The sturdy, intelligent people of Greece were a fertile field for the renewal of industry and trade after the disturbance that must have followed the rise in prices deriving from the augmentation of precious metal reserves resulting from the flow of Assyrian plunder onto the bullion markets. And later, with Babylonia once again supreme, following the victories of Nabopolassar in 605 BC, from the flow of Babylonian plunder. At the same time, Greece was a place of refuge from the war clouds drifting over all that Near East world, and the stench of slaughter that followed the warring hosts. It would not be long before the skill of the Aramaean at letters, money, counterfeit or otherwise, and in organization of industry, stirred the peasant kingdoms of Greece. Industries rose under the guidance of these refugees, similar to those of their homelands, to be later followed by a money economy as to the silver standards of Babylonia, and by the systematic spreading of money madness amongst the landed aristocracy of Greece, thus separating them from their peoples for whom they had been the hereditary guides. For their peoples and their labors had now become but ciphers, desirable wealth assessed as according to the figures in the banker's book. The people who drifted into the cities as slave or freeman and found employment in the organized manufactories of these strangers, who by now were calling themselves Greeks, and who were by now bearing Greek names, not unnaturally gave their allegiance to that new hand that seemed to feed them. Eagerly, just as in today, they drank at the fountain of hatred of their former masters, who, through their sanction of these activities of these quote-unquote new Greeks, and connivance with them in respect to the new money system they set up, betrayed both their people and themselves. Among the first steps towards the total monetization of the wealth and labor of the Greek peoples to a precious metal standard controllable by the great banking houses of Babylonia was the permitting of the striking of a silver coinage on the island of Aegina by Phaedon, quote-unquote progressive king of Argos in 680 BC, similar to the private coinage that was issued in Lydia prior to Croesus. Quote-unquote progressive king of Argos meant, in this case, a king ready to listen to the blandishments of money power, luring him into that trap which was the use of precious metal currency, over which he could have relatively little control, since silver, as its base, was to be obtained only at great expense by slave labor at localities too often far distant, and relative to localities yielding iron or copper few and far between. True, the silver used by the moneyers of Aegina probably came from Lorien in sight across the sea. But even though the source of supply was so close at hand, a coinage of which so small a unit represented so much value placed the economy, through the practices of banking, into the hands of the international bullion controllers. That the bankers, known as trapezite, conducted almost the same business as bankers today is clearly indicated by the article in Seffert's Classical Dictionary, even if, as the word trapezite indicates, they but sat at a bench in the marketplace instead of sitting in gilded halls surmounted by 60-story buildings, as indeed they do today. Within the limits of clay tablet and stylus, the same confidence game was operated, though probably there were few who understood it as being such. Yesterday, it was a conspiracy against the men of a city or a relatively small state. Today, a conspiracy against the whole world. Those that have their hands on the throttle of this all-embracing evil do not, however, bear the faintest resemblance to whole-hearted demons in hell, or gods who in their mountain halls contemptuously plan the total eradication of man who may be their complete failure. They are but pudgy and sly little men, as much overwhelmed by the monster they have raised as are the foolish nations that permitted them to do so. Of ancient Greek banking, Seffert says, quote, "Bankers were called by the Greeks trapezite, because they sat at tables in the marketplaces, the center of all business transactions. They acted as money changers, exchanging for a commission heavy money or gold to smaller coin, and the monies of different systems with each other. In commercial cities, they would do a considerable trade in this way. The different standards and the uncertainty of the stamping of the coins in Greece created a great demand for their assistance. They also acted as money lenders both on a small and a large scale. Finally, they received money on deposit. People placed their money with them for safe custody, partly to facilitate the management of it. The depositors, according to their convenience, either drew out sums of money themselves or commissioned their banker to make payment to a third person. In this line, the business of the banks was considerable. If a citizen had a large sum of money circulating in business, he probably preferred to put it in a bank and to hand over to the banker the business of making his payments. Strangers, too, found that the banks offered them such facilities that they were glad to make considerable use of them. The bankers kept strict account of all monies in their charge. If a person were making a payment to another who was a depositor at the same bank, the banker would simply transfer the requisite sum from one account to another. The bankers were generally well known from the public character of their occupation, and they naturally gained great experience in business. Consequently, their advice and assistance were often asked for in the ordinary affairs of life. They would be called in to attest the conclusion of contracts and would take charge of sums of money, the title to which was disputed, and of important documents. Business of this kind was generally in the hands of resident aliens, unquote. There it is. There it is. Ooh, that sounds like today. The above quotation from the great German scholar Oskar Seffert leaves those of us who understand the origins and meaning of today's banking little doubt, as previously pointed out, that within the limits of clay tablet and stylus, every fraudulent practice known to banking would have been practiced. Also, the commonly accepted idea that instruments used in foreign trade, such as letters of credit, bills of exchange, etc., were a discovery of the 12th century A.D., is further clearly proved erroneous by the sentence, quote, "Strangers, too, found that the banks offered them facilities that they were glad to make considerable use of them," unquote. Therefore, behind the monetary reforms of King Phaedon of Argos, we must not see the wonder of what so many so-called scholars would call the arrival of the quote-unquote invention of coinage in Greece, but the comings and goings of strange aliens with letters from mysterious quote-unquote important men who dwelt in Tyre or Sidon or Sardis, or who dwelt in Babylonia itself. Everything to be in the name of quote-unquote progress. Everything to be joy and light. The only thing our poor peasant king had to ask himself was, quote, joy and light for whom? Us or these panderers, pornographers, and luxury peddlers who now flock to our shores, unquote. Very soon, no doubt, the answer became apparent. Behind the Aramaic-speaking banker came the slave trader, and it was not long before the poor people found that the king's law was no longer for them, and was but a measure behind which these glib and double-talking bankers operated. "We must protect the people's savings," no doubt was their cry, yesterday as in today. Such silver coinage as was produced at Aegina or Argos would have been no more than a few seen symbols, the apex of an inverted pyramid of unseen or abstract symbols of which only the money master really understood the meaning and purpose, and only he knew how to manipulate. Through manipulation of these quote-unquote credits in relation to the silver that people now thought was their money, King Phaedon himself could have been tricked into believing himself a slave because he could not repay his so-called quote-unquote debt. However, the banker needed the king as such for a while yet, no doubt. In the meantime, peasantry and lesser nobility were drawn into this trap of irredeemable debt. Sound familiar, Americans? And, as the king's law had to be upheld, they and their families would be sold into that cruel slave system that was growing up all over the Mediterranean world. That's why your wife's out there working, American eunuch male. And through which money economy, now grown into a very monster, could find docile labor for the dreary grind of the new methods of semi-mass production in manufacture, such as it had brought into being, and against which the reforms of Solon, as described in the previous chapter, were directed. History should not be misled by the Greek names of those significant figures and families concerned with money and money power at that time, whether in Lydia or in Greece. Oscar Seffert states quite clearly that the bankers, or trapezite, were resident aliens, controlling the undercurrents of city life, as undoubtedly they would have so done. In those days it would have been no more difficult than it is in these days to secure the services of a front man to promote their interests and secure them citizenship if necessary, just as aliens who seek trade and power amongst whatever people they may be, so often change their names to suit the circumstances while retaining allegiance to that group into which they were born. So it was in that day, nearly 3,000 years ago. In the early days of the Greek cities, citizenship was easy to obtain, and persons with pretense at power, influence, and money, in a society where worship of money had replaced worship of the gods, in truth, would have no great difficulty in that direction. Out of the weakening of what was left of the true power of kingly rule at Athens, such as descended from Mycenaean Greece, and consequent growth of quote-unquote aristocratic democracy, doubtless deriving from concession to international money power for its assistance against the Dorian previous to 1100 BC, and before whom it appears the city of Athens never fell, came the replacement of the title Wanax, indicating God-King reigning in earthly splendor, for that Archon Basileus of lesser degree. Out of the further weakening of such aristocracy of the Greeks as later existed, whether Achaean, Ionian, or Dorian, and the soul destruction sown amongst them as consequence of their betrayal into slavery and abuse of their followers who had so trusted them and looked to them for guidance, derived those conditions out of which the so-called tyrant rose to power. Out of the involvement of the natural leaders of the people with things ignoble and inimical to their own kind, such as trade and quote-unquote money-making, and with strange luxuries and vices, rose those men, often traitors to their own class, who fronted for the conspiratorial money power of the age. He's describing all of the U.S. presidents and congressmen. Such men steered the restless aspirations of the wage slaves of the cities, those dispossessed masses so easily stirred to active resentment against their former leaders, deriving from the ancient nobility, and who, of course, had no more understanding than themselves of that force by which they were both being manipulated. Okay, folks, you've been listening to Part 6 of the Babylonian Woe by David Astle. I'm Gordon Comstock. This has been the Ministry of Truth. Over and out.